More than 1 million people told to isolate in just a week. Record-breaking numbers with no end in sight. The government's under pressure to change the way the system works, with businesses and politicians pleading for them to sort it out. Also tonight, anger and anguish at the Croydon tram inquest as it rules the crash in which 7 people died was an accident.
I have a 3-year-old daughter that will never meet her grandfather because of this accident.
More trouble in Tokyo ahead of the Olympics opening ceremony tomorrow night. Its director has got the sack and... Three decades worth of school kids take to the streets to say a special goodbye to their retiring lollipop lady.
Almost everyone said, "We're going to miss your smile." So, yeah, I think it's important to smile.
This is the ITV Evening News with Charlene White.
Good evening. There's growing pressure on the government tonight to scrap isolation for those who come into contact with someone with COVID. Supermarkets, petrol companies and manufacturers say the huge numbers of staff forced off work is causing shortages. Police have warned it's affecting their ability to deal with crime. And former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt said if plans to relax rules for the double jabbed aren't brought forward, the government will lose the public's consent. It came as figures showed 1 million people have been told to isolate in just a week. Here's our political correspondent, Libby Vina.
The government insists food supplies are holding up, but the empty shelves in many supermarkets suggest that may not be true for much longer. Staff shortages are so acute, the boss of this company says his workers must now be exempted from self-isolation.
The government says that it wants to make sure that critical services can function. Well, Iceland is a critical service and we're struggling to function at the moment. So that's why we need clarity, and we need key worker exemption for retail workers, but also HGV drivers.
In the Commons, one former health secretary said it was time to exempt all those who are double jabbed.
Does he not think it's time for the government to listen to public opinion and scrap the 10-day isolation requirement immediately for people who are pinged who have been double jabbed?
If you allow all these things to happen too rapidly and people then decide not to self-isolate, then I think you run the risk of infection rates running away with us.
In England alone, the latest figures show that more than 600,000 people were pinged by the NHS COVID app. That's a record high, up 17% in a week. Separately, 428,000 people were contacted and told to self-isolate by Test and Trace. That's up 27%, a total of more than 1 million notifications in a week. This restaurant and bar was forced to close because so many staff were self-isolating. Hit hard by the pandemic, the pingdemic is now taking its toll.
It's an absolute living nightmare. We've gone from a lockdown to a shutdown. I wait nervously for our ops team to call me to tell us about the new, isolating case or a kitchen team having to isolate.
Disruption is also now affecting public transport, with some services on Southern and Thameslink set to be cancelled because of staff shortages, while those in Manchester putting the bins out may find that some of their rubbish is not being collected. Well, this was the week when things were meant to be getting back to normal, but it won't have felt like that for the hundreds of thousands of people stuck self-isolating at home. Meanwhile, 4 days after the Prime Minister promised there'd be a list of critical workers who'd be exempted, we're still waiting.
Libby, thank you. And the government is facing another growing political crisis, this time over pay. It confirmed today that the 3% pay rise for NHS staff in England would come out of the existing health service budget. And the Police Federation, which represents rank and file officers, say they've lost faith in the Home Secretary after their pay was frozen. Our political reporter, Shihab Khan, is outside the Home Office for us. Shihab, this is becoming increasingly difficult for ministers, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. And as you mentioned, one of the latest developments comes from the Police Federation of England and Wales. They represent more than 130,000 police officers, and they are not happy that officers who get paid more than £24,000 a year will have their pay frozen. They say that they've been working through very difficult circumstances during the pandemic. And as you say they've lost confidence in the Home Secretary, which is an incredibly strong statement. Now, I'm told that a pay body made this decision because of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And senior sources at the Home Office, they say they're not going to get drawn into criticising the Police Federation, but they have defended the Home Secretary's record when it comes to policing. Now, this is part of a wider story about public sector pay. You mentioned that NHS 3% pay rise. We know that the government is willing to do it. Some unions say it's not enough. What we've learned today is that it will be coming out of the existing NHS budget, so there won't be any extra money for the NHS for this. And questions are being asked about what frontline services may need to be cut for this to be paid for. So you're right, it is a very difficult time for ministers right now.
Chihab, thank you. The families of 7 passengers killed in the Croydon tram crash say justice has not been done after an inquest jury ruled they died accidentally. They're angry that the coroner refused to call witnesses about the alleged safety failings. The tram was travelling at almost 4 times over the speed limit when it derailed. Relatives are now vowing to fight on, as Sejal Karia reports.
It was the worst tram crash in Britain in a century, when this tram travelling at speed round a bend toppled over after spinning off the tracks in South London in November 2016. 7 people died. Today, a jury concluded they weren't unlawfully killed, but died as a result of an accident. Karina's father, Philip Seary, was among the victims. Like other families, she's angry and disappointed.
Let down, heartbroken, devastated, all over again. The driver is the only person that knows why my dad isn't here. I have a 3-year-old daughter that will never meet her grandfather because of this accident.
This reconstruction shows the tram hitting a sharp bend at 73 kilometres per hour in a 20 kilometre per hour zone, almost 4 times the speed limit, causing it to derail and overturn. The accident happened at this junction close to the Sandylands tram stop in Croydon. Crash investigators said it was fast and violent and that passengers were thrown out of the tram. And it was over in just a matter of seconds. Today, the jury concluded the driver lost awareness after becoming disorientated and may have briefly fallen asleep. And they criticised the tram operators for a culture that stopped drivers reporting safety concerns.
For this tragedy, justice has been suffocated, and instead of providing long-awaited answers, the families have been put through more agony. Ultimately, they feel that nobody has been held accountable for their loved ones' deaths.
Both Transport for London, which runs the capital's network, and the tram operators say they've since introduced new safety measures. But families say this is not the end. They are now pressing for a fresh inquest and public inquiry. Sejal Karia, ITV News.
Well, there is a public inquiry into the Manchester Arena terror attack, of course. And today it heard harrowing evidence from survivors about the emergency services response. The mother of Holly Booth said her daughter had been left to bleed for hours. And Martin Hibbert described the long, agonising wait for help. As our correspondent Hannah Miller reports, they are among 940 survivors, many of whom feel let down.
While the sirens blared outside, inside the arena, survivors said today they felt abandoned by the medical response. Martin Hibbert and his then 14-year-old daughter Eve were just 6 metres away when the bomb went off. It was nearly 2 hours before a paramedic came to save their lives. Martin watched his daughter being covered with T-shirts and posters because people thought she was dead.
People were looking at her injury and saying that it wasn't survivable, and they just covered her up even though she was alive. And they weren't qualified to make that kind of choice.
Martin was paralysed from the waist down. His daughter survived with a very significant brain injury.
Do you feel like the people who were there that night were let down?
Of course. I knew we were in there an hour and didn't get any help, and that we could have died, and obviously that Eve had been covered. You know what I mean? And I had to, and that just stayed with me. Like, well, what if I'd have lost consciousness? She won't be here.
and it's just wrong.
Today was an opportunity for the survivors to tell this inquiry what happened that night in their own words. The individual acts that ultimately saved lives and the time they spent wondering whether help would come.
A year after the attack, Holly Booth was well enough to wow the judges on Britain's Got Talent. But today her mum Claire said that on the night she'd been left to bleed for 3.5 hours before being taken out in an ambulance.
It was just very chaotic. There didn't seem to be a plan.
Bradley Hurley recalled looking over to realise his sister Megan had died. He said police officers seemed frustrated that paramedics hadn't arrived.
There'd been a terrorist attack, but there was just not what you would expect for when that, like you would think that when that happens, there's going to be like so much help and you're going to be like straight to hospital, but it just wasn't like that at all.
The inquiry will continue to look at the role the emergency services played, as many of those who survived remain haunted by the memory of the night that 22 victims lost their lives. Hannah Miller, ITV News, Manchester.
The Housing Secretary has told ITV News that the pay of some housing association chief executives is out of control. Robert Jenrick defended the government's role after our investigation revealed shocking conditions in council and social housing. Well, our political correspondent Daniel Hewitt, who unearthed the scandal, joins us now. Daniel, what did Mr Jenrick have to say about your findings then?
I think, Charlene, what we saw today from the Housing Secretary was an attempt to deflect any kind of responsibility for what we've been showing. I think deflect any kind of blame that may come the government's way from what we've shown in our investigation. The pictures we're about to show you are now have been the subject of 5 separate inquiries from regulators to ombudsmen to governments. Robert Jenrick today said it was disgusting, but despite a chronic shortage of housing, despite the government cutting lots of support and money for councils and housing associations over the last few years, he said that was no excuse for what we're seeing right now. He had a particular criticism for housing associations. Like councils, they provide affordable housing for rent for people. They are independent companies. They earn quite big money. Their chief executives earn up to £400,000 a year. And he said, given what we've been finding, that needs to be looked at again.
There is absolutely no excuse for them to be providing anything other than the best possible service to their residents.
Do you think they've got too big? They're paying themselves too much money?
I think executive pay is out of control in some of the housing associations that you've highlighted, absolutely. And I think they need to return to the kind of social and moral mission which is what housing associations and the charities that came before them really originated from.
Now, councils and housing associations will look at that and say Robert Jenrick has some cheek, given how much support has been taken off them in the last few years, for him to blame them solely for this problem. I can tell you they won't be happy with that.
OK, Daniel, thanks very much. And still to come in the ITV Evening News. MPs call for an overhaul in how sport deals with head injuries. And Sir Andy Murray on why he wouldn't give up on his Olympic dream.
For me, it's just special to be part of an Olympic team.
Those stories and more after the break.
She doesn't remember I'm her daughter, but I do. I'm walking for my mum. Who will you walk for? Sign up at memorywalk.org.uk.
Let's dress well to feel good. 2. Be you.
Bit of a nervous smile there, Neil. Twins. On top of these two. But you were the one who didn't want the... Anyways, now you need a bigger motor. You need Cinch.
Cinch?
Cinch? Cinch lets you buy a quality checked used car online. No haggling.
Welcome back. The Olympics have been hit by yet more drama and controversy just a day before the Tokyo Games opening ceremony. The show's director has been sacked after it emerged the comedian had made jokes about the Holocaust. And public opinion in Japan is firmly against the Games. But as our sports editor Steve Scott reports from Tokyo, Team GB athletes insist it's still something special.
They are small-scale and sporadic, but they speak for millions. Past polls suggest as many as 80% in Japan want the Games cancelled. The most recent revealed 2/3 of the country doesn't trust organisers to contain the spread of COVID-19. It is a sentiment articulated loudest by the country's health professionals.
Volunteers and the people will gather from all over this country to Tokyo. And they may bring virus to Tokyo and mix and incubate.
These games will look like nothing before them. Shiny new venues, full only of row after row of empty seats. Upper estimates suggest it will cost up to £25 billion to stage. Ticket sales alone would have recouped £1 billion of that. These games have faced challenges at every turn. Only yesterday, the musical director for the opening ceremony quit. Today, the main director was sacked for comments he made more than 20 years ago. The ceremony itself will be scaled back. There'll be no mass choreography, of course, and it will reflect how the world has lived through the pandemic. Britain's flag bearer in Rio is back again. He admits it's a very different experience, but well worth it.
Yeah, I think this time round the athletes are a little bit more cautious about spending time with each other and mixing too much. But yeah, it's just still like, for me, like it's just special to be part of an Olympic team and be part of the British team.
It is a double honour this time round, falling to Olympic rowing gold medalist Mo Sabihi and another Olympic champion, the sailor Hannah Mills, here on the right.
This Games is going to be unique. There's many kind of strange things about it that are different from before, but I'm carrying the flag for everyone back at home and everyone here and all the athletes.
Tokyo entered its latest state of emergency 10 days ago, yet is still about to host a giant party. The athletes are invited, but most of the usual guest list has been told to stay well away. Steve Scott, ITV News, Tokyo.
Postmasters wrongly convicted over a faulty computer system will each receive up to £100,000 from the government. Dozens of workers were accused of stealing money from the post office branches they ran. Some were even jailed, but it was later proved the accounting errors were a fault of their software. Police in Kent have released this body-worn footage of the moment an officer saved an arsonist's life. Sergeant James Cattermole smashed a window to pull Christopher Payne to safety. The judge commended the officer's bravery as he sentenced Payne to 4 years in jail. And reigning Rugby League World Cup champions Australia won't compete in this autumn's tournament in England. Along with New Zealand's national side, they pulled out over COVID concerns. There have been urgent calls for the government to action to address what MPs have called a long-term failure to reduce brain injuries in sport. A report says there has been a dereliction of duty from sporting bodies. It's a particular issue for rugby players and footballers who are at risk of repeated concussions. Rebecca Barry heard from one former England rugby international who says his brain injuries have left him struggling to survive.
Johnny Wilkinson, he's got it!
It's just bizarre feeling because I'm watching the games and I can see me. Just can't remember being in Australia at all. There's just no memory there whatsoever.
He's only 42, but early onset dementia has robbed Steve Thompson of his World Cup memories and much more.
Do I wish I hadn't done all the professional stuff and that? Yeah, I do. You know, they talk about concussion, but the concussion is like it's a brain injury. Look at me now, I've got young kids and, you know, struggling to live day to day at times.
Now, a parliamentary report on brain injuries in sport says the government should set a definition for concussion. There should be a framework for reporting sports injuries and a paid medical officer at every major sporting event.
These dark areas here are actually bleeding within the brain.
For the first time, scientists have used advanced neuroimaging techniques to look at the brains of professional rugby players. The results out today suggest a quarter of the players had abnormalities in their brain structure, and of those that returned for follow-up scans, half had an unexpected reduction in brain volume, though the long-term impacts are not yet clear.
for Astle, going in!
It's nearly 20 years since a coroner ruled England's Jeff Astle died of dementia brought on by repeatedly heading the ball. Today's report criticises the FA and accuses the health and safety executive of a dereliction of duty.
For my dad and for other professionals, it's just their job, and they should be afforded the same protection from known risks as anybody else in any other job. And I find it astounding that health and safety doesn't involve football.
These children are learning safe tackling techniques. The RFU insists significant progress has been made, while the FA says it will work through the recommendations. Rebecca Barry, ITV News.
A new photograph has been released of Prince George to celebrate his 8th birthday. Taken by his mother, the picture shows him perching on the bonnet of a Land Rover Defender, a nod to his great-grandfather, the Duke of Edinburgh, of course. And finally, there was a very fitting send-off today for a lollipop lady who's dedicated many happy years to her job. Teresa Andrews started at Woodingdean Primary School in East Sussex way back in 1987. And helping her on her final day were some of the many she's helped along the way, as Sangeeta Lal reports.
OK. She's waved children across here for more than 34 years, but today Teresa Andrews is waving them goodbye. Lollipop lady? Yes. I'm 10 years old. I know. Always well informed of the latest developments, Teresa really does know everyone here. And despite seeing thousands of children every day, she still makes each one feel special.
It's sad that she's going. I wish she could stay longer.
She's nice when you talk to her.
Yeah.
Every morning she always says like, good morning, and she's just really fun.
Oh, thank you. Oh. And it's not just these pupils that love her, it's former ones too. To mark her final day, one student from each of the 34 years she's been here walked across one last time with their lollipop lady, many now with their own children.
I thought the line was never going to stop. It was amazing. I've loved the children. I've loved this work. I feel sad to be giving it up.
And did you ever know that you meant this much to so many students?
Sort of. They all love me. They appear to anyway. Almost everyone said, we're going to miss your smile.
And you can see why.
Goodbye.
An hour after the school bell rang, it was time for her last students to step safely across the road and finally say goodbye. Sangeeta Lal, ITV News.
Now enjoy your retirement, Teresa, please do. Well, that's it from us. Tom will be here with news at 10, but for me and all of the team here, enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.